What if I told you that your intelligence is not fixed and that in many cases you could actually become significantly smarter than you are today? Not by luck, not by genetics alone, and definitely not by watching endless brain hack videos online, but by understanding how your brain truly works and learning how to train it correctly. Most people spend years believing they were simply born with a certain level of intelligence and that nothing can change it. But what if that belief is completely wrong? What if your memory, attention span, creativity, problem-solving ability, and even your IQ are far more flexible than you've been led to believe? Because the truth is, modern science paints a very different picture than what most of us grew up hearing. Today, we are going to uncover what really makes someone more intelligent, what secretly makes us mentally weaker without realizing it, and what science actually says about improving the way our brain functions. We'll talk about memory, focus, learning faster, problem solving, creativity, and even whether it is possible to gain measurable IQ points as an adult. But before we get into strategies, we need to destroy one of the biggest myths about intelligence. For decades, many scientists believed that up to 80% of intelligence was inherited. The idea was simple. Your brain was mostly predetermined by genetics, and whatever level of intelligence you were born with was more or less what you had for life. If that were true, training your brain would seem almost pointless. Why work hard if the result was already decided? But that belief turned out to be far too simplistic. Research in children has shown that inherited intelligence may account for far less than previously believed during early life, leaving enormous room for environmental influence, learning, stimulation, and training. In fact, intelligence appears to become more influenced by genetics later in life, meaning that while you are younger, your brain is incredibly adaptable. And even as adults, we still retain far more ability to improve than most people imagine. Some of the most fascinating evidence came from studies involving children raised in extremely difficult environments, including orphanages. Researchers discovered something remarkable. When children receive structured cognitive training and environmental stimulation, their average IQ scores increased dramatically. In some cases, improvements were astonishing, while children who lacked proper stimulation often showed declines over time. Imagine that for a second. Intelligence was not standing still. It was either being strengthened or quietly deteriorating depending on the environment and habits surrounding the brain. That changes everything, because if intelligence can move upward or downward, then the question is no longer, was I born smart? The real question becomes, what am I doing every day that either strengthens or weakens my brain? And honestly, this matters now more than ever. The internet is filled with advice claiming to make you smarter overnight. Eat blueberries, sleep 8 hours, drink some magical supplement, use a productivity app. But when we step away from flashy claims and look directly at the scientific evidence, something very clear begins to emerge. Intelligence is trainable, not perfectly, not infinitely, but measurably. Studies involving adolescents found that structured weekly sessions focused on problem solving, critical thinking, and creative reasoning significantly improved cognitive performance over time. What's even more interesting is that individuals who started with lower cognitive performance often improved the most. In other words, your starting point may matter less than your willingness to train. But there is something important to understand here. Intelligence is not only about speed. It is not simply about being quick with answers or sounding clever in conversation. Real intelligence is deeply connected to your ability to solve problems, adapt, understand complex ideas, and make better decisions over time. And if we are being honest, many of us are accidentally damaging these abilities every single day. Something alarming has quietly started happening in younger generations. For years, average IQ scores were increasing around the world. Better education, improved nutrition, and more intellectual stimulation help people perform better generation after generation. Scientists even had a name for this trend, the Flynn effect. But recently, researchers have started noticing the opposite. Instead of increasing cognitive performance, in many younger populations appears to be declining And one of the biggest suspects may already be sitting in your pocket. Excessive screen exposure. Now, before you panic and throw your phone across the room, let's be realistic. Technology itself is not evil. You're watching this video on a screen right now. The problem isn't screens alone. The real problem is something far more subtle: chronic overstimulation. Your brain evolved in an environment where attention was precious. Focus mattered for survival. But today, our minds are constantly pulled in 10 different directions at once. Notifications, short videos, social media feeds, endless scrolling, constant entertainment. We are living in an environment where your attention is under attack every second of the day. And your brain notices. Studies increasingly suggest that excessive sensory stimulation, especially from overusing screens, may interfere with cognitive development, emotional regulation, focus, and behavioral control. In adolescents and young adults, researchers have linked chronic overstimulation to problems with attention, concentration, memory formation, and emotional balance. Think about that carefully. Many people today complain that they cannot focus on books anymore. They struggle to stay concentrated during conversations. They forget things more easily. They start tasks but cannot finish them. They feel mentally foggy. What if that isn't laziness? What if your brain is simply adapting to an environment that constantly rewards distraction? Because your brain is incredibly efficient. It becomes better at whatever you repeatedly train it to do. Train distraction long enough, and concentration becomes harder. Train shallow stimulation long enough, and deep thinking starts feeling uncomfortable. And this matters far more than most people realize, because your ability to focus may be one of the strongest predictors of how intelligent you appear, how effectively you learn, and how capable you become over time. The good news is that none of this means permanent damage. The brain is far more adaptable than people think, but it does mean something uncomfortable. If we want to become more intelligent, we cannot just add good habits. We also have to stop feeding the habits quietly, making us mentally weaker. And once you understand what those habits are, the next step becomes incredibly powerful, because there are specific ways to train your brain that improve memory, sharpen attention, strengthen creativity, and help you think in ways most people never learn to access. So now that we understand something critical, that intelligence is not fixed, and that modern habits may be quietly sabotaging our cognitive potential, the next question becomes obvious. If your brain can improve, how exactly do you train it? The answer begins with something surprisingly simple: problem solving, not passive learning, not endlessly consuming motivational videos, not memorizing random facts to sound smarter in conversations. Real intelligence grows when your brain is forced to wrestle with problems it does not immediately know how to solve. This is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about intelligence. Many assume smart people simply know more. But knowledge and intelligence are not the same thing. Someone can have enormous amounts of information stored in their brain and still struggle to apply it effectively. On the other hand, someone with less information but stronger reasoning skills can often outperform them in real life. What we truly admire in intelligent people is usually not just what they know, it's how they think. Can they connect ideas? Can they solve problems creatively? Can they adapt when situations change? Can they stay calm long enough to think clearly under pressure? That is where intelligence becomes practical. And science suggests one of the best ways to strengthen these abilities is through deliberate problem-solving exercises that force your brain to think differently. In studies where participants improved cognitive performance over time, one of the recurring themes was structured mental challenges. These weren't simple memory games or repetitive drills. They involved tasks that required creative thinking, lateral thinking, and critical reasoning. Imagine questions like this. If humans discovered valuable resources on the moon, how could we transport them back to Earth without relying on rockets? Or imagine this situation. You are tied to a tree with your hands and feet restrained, and a piece of bread sits just out of reach in front of you. How could you get to it without moving from your position? At first, these questions might sound silly, but they are doing something important. They force your brain to stop relying on familiar mental shortcuts and start building new connections. And this is where something fascinating happens. Your brain begins learning flexibility, because intelligence is not just about remembering information, it is about escaping rigid thinking. Many of us unknowingly train our brains into predictability. We follow routines, consume the same content, repeat the same thought patterns, and rarely challenge ourselves mentally. But cognitive growth happens when your brain encounters problems slightly beyond its current abilities. Too easy, and your brain becomes bored. Too difficult, and your brain becomes overwhelmed. The sweet spot lies just above your comfort zone. Think of it like physical training. You don't build muscle by lifting weights that are too light to challenge you. But lifting something impossibly heavy doesn't work either. Growth happens when you stretch your current capacity just enough. Your brain works exactly the same way. And this leads us to something deeply important that many people completely misunderstand about becoming smarter. Sometimes you do not need a higher IQ. Sometimes you simply need better knowledge. We often confuse intelligence with expertise. Think about someone who seems incredibly smart when talking about investing, medicine, business, technology, or psychology. Sometimes what impresses us is not raw intellectual power at all. What we are actually witnessing is accumulated knowledge used effectively, and that distinction matters. Because if you want to become more capable, one of the fastest ways is not necessarily increasing intelligence, it is increasing useful knowledge. The problem is that most people learn inefficiently. They consume information constantly but retain very little of it. They watch videos, read articles, listen to podcasts, and weeks later barely remember anything. Why? Because the human brain was never designed to store endless information for no reason. Your brain is extremely practical. It prioritizes what feels important for survival, success, emotional meaning, or repeated use. In simple terms, your brain remembers what it believes matters. That means if you consume information but never apply it, your brain quietly labels it as unimportant, and eventually it disappears. You've probably experienced this yourself. Maybe you read an amazing self-improvement book. You felt inspired for a few days. You highlighted sections. You told yourself this would change everything. And then a month later, most of it was gone. Not because you are bad at learning, but because your brain had no reason to keep the information. This is why one of the most powerful rules of learning is surprisingly simple. Use what you learn. The fastest way to strengthen memory and intelligence is to immediately apply information in real life. Learning about communication, practice it in conversations. Learning about fitness, change your routine. Learning psychology, start observing behavior patterns around you. Learning business, test ideas. Your brain rewards action. When you repeatedly use information, something remarkable happens. Neural pathways become stronger. Connections become faster. Skills become automatic. Think about driving a car. At first, everything feels overwhelming. Mirrors, steering, pedals, timing, traffic. Your brain feels overloaded. But after enough repetition, you stop consciously thinking about it. Your brain automated the process. That same mechanism applies to almost every cognitive skill. But what if you cannot immediately practice something you're learning? This is where science becomes incredibly interesting. Research suggests that mental rehearsal, vividly imagining yourself performing a skill, can create surprisingly similar learning effects to actual practice. Athletes use this all the time. Musicians use it. Surgeons use it. Your brain often struggles to distinguish between deeply imagined experiences and real ones. If mental practice is detailed and immersive enough, it can strengthen neural pathways associated with performance. That means if you are learning a skill you cannot physically practice yet, visualizing yourself doing it step by step may still help your brain prepare. But there is another mistake people make when trying to become more intelligent. They believe they must learn everything. You do not. In fact, trying to remember everything often becomes the reason people remember almost nothing. Instead, think in terms of leverage. In almost every subject, a small percentage of ideas produce most of the results. This is sometimes called the 80/20 principle. For example, imagine learning about health. You could spend years drowning in complicated details, or you could focus first on a few high-impact fundamentals. Sleep quality, nutrition, movement, stress management, and consistency. The same applies to almost anything. Instead of obsessing over every detail, identify the few concepts that create the biggest difference. Learn them, apply them, repeat them, then build from there. Because intelligence is not about stuffing your brain with information. It is about knowing what matters and using it effectively. And that brings us to one of the most underrated skills for becoming smarter, something modern life is quietly destroying in millions of people every single day. Your attention span. Without it, learning becomes weaker. Memory suffers, relationships decline, problem solving becomes harder, and your brain slowly loses one of its greatest strengths. There is a hidden reason why so many people today feel mentally slower than they used to. They say things like, I can't focus anymore, I forget what I just read, or my brain feels foggy. And many assume it is stress, aging, or lack of motivation. But often, the real problem is something much simpler. Attention. Because attention is the doorway to almost everything we associate with intelligence. Without attention, you cannot learn deeply. Without attention, memory becomes weak. Without attention, complex thinking falls apart. And without attention, even someone with extraordinary potential can end up functioning far below what their brain is truly capable of. Think about this honestly for a moment. When was the last time you sat down and focused on one difficult task without checking your phone, switching tabs, or getting distracted? For many people, even 10 uninterrupted minutes feels difficult now. And that should concern us, because concentration is not just something you either have or do not have, it is trainable. But like any skill, it weakens when neglected. Imagine attention like a muscle. If you never challenge it, it becomes weaker. If you constantly interrupt it, it loses endurance. But if you train it consistently, it becomes stronger. The challenge is that modern life has trained most of us in the opposite direction. Short videos, instant notifications, fast entertainment, constant stimulation. Your brain has quietly adapted to expecting novelty every few seconds. So when you try to sit with something slower, reading a book, studying, deep thinking, solving a problem, your brain suddenly feels restless. It wants stimulation. It wants rewards. It wants distraction. That discomfort many people feel when trying to focus, that is not proof you are incapable. It is proof your brain has been conditioned. And the good news is that conditioning can be reversed. One of the simplest ways to rebuild attention is something surprisingly old-fashioned. Reading, not because books are magical, but because reading forces your brain to practice sustained focus. When you sit with a book, especially one requiring concentration, you are training your brain to hold attention on one thing for an extended period of time. That process matters more than people realize, because intelligence often requires uninterrupted thought. You cannot deeply understand complicated ideas if your mind keeps switching every 30 seconds. You cannot solve difficult problems if your focus collapses halfway through. Even emotional intelligence depends on attention. Think about relationships for a moment. Listening deeply to a partner, a friend, or your child requires focus. Being present is a cognitive skill, and many of us are losing it. Now, here is where people make a major mistake. They start with books that are far too difficult. Maybe they suddenly decide they are going to become smarter and buy advanced neuroscience books, philosophy texts, or technical material. And after 20 pages, they quit. Not because they are incapable, but because they tried to sprint before learning how to walk. Imagine someone who has never exercised suddenly deciding to run 2 hours nonstop. It would feel miserable. Reading works the same way. If you want to build focus, begin with material you actually enjoy. This is important. Your brain learns habits much more effectively when pleasure is involved. If reading feels like punishment, you will not sustain it. But if it feels enjoyable, your brain starts associating learning with reward. That means if fiction excites you, start there. If mystery novels keep your attention, perfect. Fantasy, great. Even something like Harry Potter can be valuable if it gets you reading consistently. Because at the beginning, the goal is not proving how intellectual you are. The goal is building the habit, building focus, building endurance, and strengthening attention. Over time, once your concentration improves, you can gradually move into more complex material. Science books, psychology, history, health, business, anything that expands useful knowledge. But there is another mistake many people make when trying to learn. They read whatever everyone else recommends. The same best-selling books, the same trending ideas, the same must-read lists repeated endlessly online. Now, there is nothing wrong with popular books, but if everyone consumes identical information, everyone ends up thinking similarly. And often, what makes someone seem remarkably intelligent is not that they know common things, it is that they know useful things others overlook. Think about this strategically. What knowledge would actually improve your life? Would understanding health improve your energy? Would learning psychology improve your relationships? Would learning business improve your financial future? Would learning communication make you more persuasive? Choose knowledge that solves problems you genuinely care about, because relevance increases motivation, and motivation improves learning. The truth is, people learn fastest when information feels immediately useful. Think about language learning. Many people struggle learning languages in classrooms for years. Yet someone immersed in a country where survival depends on speaking the language often learns incredibly fast. Why? Because importance changes everything. When your brain believes something matters, attention rises, motivation rises, memory improves. That is why one of the most powerful questions you can ask before learning something is simple. How will this help me? Find the answer first. Then your brain starts paying attention. But attention alone is not enough. Even if you improve focus, consume useful knowledge, and build stronger habits, there is still one huge challenge. Most people still forget what they learn. They study hard, they consume information, they feel inspired, and weeks later, most of it disappears. So, how do intelligent people seem to remember so much? Is memory something you are born with, or can it actually be trained? Because once you understand how memory really works, learning becomes dramatically easier. And surprisingly, some of the most powerful memory techniques are far simpler than most people think. Have you ever met someone who seems to remember everything? Names, numbers, details from conversations years ago, books they read months earlier, random facts that somehow appear exactly when needed? Most people assume these individuals were simply born with exceptional memory. But that assumption is usually wrong, because memory is not just talent. Memory is strategy. And once you understand how the brain decides what deserves to be remembered, something incredible happens. Learning becomes easier, information stays longer, and your mind starts feeling sharper in ways that surprise you. The first thing to understand is this. Your brain is constantly filtering information. Every single day, your mind receives an overwhelming amount of data. Conversations, emails, videos, emotions, sounds, responsibilities, random thoughts. If your brain tried to store everything equally, it would become overwhelmed almost instantly. So instead, it asks a simple question. Is this important? And your brain has very specific ways of deciding things that feel emotional, unusual, useful, repeated, or tied to survival tend to stay. Everything else, your brain quietly lets go. This is why bizarre memories often stick. You might forget what someone told you 3 days ago, yet still remember an embarrassing moment from 10 years ago in painful detail. Emotion matters. Novelty matters. Meaning matters. And smart memory techniques take advantage of exactly that. One famous technique is something called the memory palace. You may have heard of it before. It works especially well when remembering lists, sequences, or structured information by mentally placing ideas inside familiar locations in your imagination. But there are simpler strategies you can use immediately in everyday life. For example, if remembering details about people matters to you, and honestly, one powerful trick is to turn information into stories. Think about the people close to you, your friends, your family, your coworkers. Everyone around you is constantly dealing with challenges, goals, dreams, and struggles. Instead of trying to memorize random details mechanically, imagine their lives like missions in a game. Someone trying to change careers, that becomes an active mission. Someone struggling with health, another mission. Someone planning something exciting, a new quest unfolding. Why does this help? Because your brain naturally remembers narratives better than disconnected facts. Stories create emotional weight, and emotional weight tells your brain this matters. That simple shift can dramatically improve relationships too. Because when you remember details about someone's life, they feel genuinely seen. And people often mistake good memory for intelligence. But what they are really noticing is attention and care.